Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Elizabeth Dias and Lisa Lerer, author of a new book, which is already a bestseller, titled The Fall of Roe, The Rise of a New America from Flatiron Books. Elizabeth is a national religion correspondent for the New York Times and has reported on religion and politics for 15 years. She's reported from more than 50 states and written about religion in 4 presidential elections. Prior to joining the Times in 2018, she covered religion, politics, and national news at Time magazine, where she traveled with Pope Francis, interviewed the Dalai Lama, and explored conservative Christianity's rise to power with the Trump movement. She's a graduate of Wheaton College and has an MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary. Lisa is a national political correspondent for the New York Times who has written about American politics, power, and elections for nearly 2 decades. She has covered 5 presidential campaigns, the White House, and Congress. Her focus is examining the big personalities, ideas, and emotions that drive American politics. She joined the Times in 2018 as the founding author of the On Politics newsletter. Previously, she was a national political writer at the Associated Press and reported for Politico, Bloomberg News, Business Week, and the American Lawyer magazine. Lisa was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University and is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and the Columbia Journalism School. You can learn more at nytimes.com and flatironbooks.com. So many congratulations to both of you on all of your amazing work and this incredible book.
Thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're glad to have a conversation about it.
I was very excited about it when I found out that it was coming out. I've known Elizabeth for several years. At least I'm just getting to know, but was so glad to hear about this. So first of all, is there anything else that either of you would like people to know about you than what I kind of briefly touched on?
No, I think we just say Lisa and I actually joined the New York Times around the same time in 2018 on the politics desk, covering the new political climate and new kind of culture in America with former President Trump's election, and we became friends and covered these issues of not just abortion but changing American politics and culture together. And we're thinking about how we might work together on a book in the future, and maybe we'll get into it, but we were actually listening together on opposite sides of the country to the Supreme Court case, the Dobbs case that eventually overturned Roe v. Wade. And we're sort of sitting there and it hit us like, surely someone must be writing a book about this, really exploring this important history because this case will be overturned. And we looked around and then realized that was us. We were probably going to be the ones to do that. So it's been a privilege to be able to cover this important time in American history.
Lisa, how about you? Anything you'd like to add as background?
Well, I think what's interesting is it's funny. When we started on this project, some of our colleagues at the New York Times were very confused as to why the politics reporter, the religion reporter, they sort of saw these as separate spheres. But I think what's really undergirded a lot of both of our work is our approach to politics, that we really approach it from this like deeply human angle. There are plenty of people at the paper and other places that cover the data and the organizing and the ads and I do some of that. That's part of my job. But I think our focus has always been to look at politics as this really human act, that voting is this profoundly human act, and that it's a way that people sort of express their values in some form. And it is so much integrated with, the culture of American life. And so to approach it from this cultural perspective rather than sort of this tactical perspective. And I think that's a similarity that we had in our work. And it's one that really, I think just we've heard from early readers just really comes through in the book. It's just this like, for something that is such a political issue that's been so contentious and it had such an extended history, right, in the sort of culture wars of our nation, the book is really just very human, which is interesting. We thought it was really important to bring people's personal stories and bios to light as part of this project. So that's sort of one thing I think about both of our work and both of us that is maybe interesting for listeners to know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it is a very, storytelling type of book. We'll get into that in a moment here. But, most of us don't really know what journalists do, other than what we see in print, right? From the New York
Yeah.
Times or whatever. When can you give us a little bit of a glimpse behind the curtain as to what it really is like for you to work at the New York Times and be a journalist?
Sure. We love working at the New York Times. We have amazing colleagues, and it's really remarkable to be at a place where the mission is really about, uh, you know, we have a slogan, "The truth is worth it." And we have these little buttons. I actually have one on my desk that reminds us of that, because the truth is often very hard. And we really believe in independent journalism and following the facts wherever they lead, without fear or favor. That's another kind of way we describe our work. But, it's a lot. I think sometimes people think this is very glamorous. It's actually mostly a lot of times in airports and cars,
I believe that.
and back roads, like trying to find out where you're headed.
Oh my God. The number of pictures there are of me sitting on floors typing on my laptop in like some VFW hall is just unbelievable. It's a common picture.
Yeah, that's actually mostly what it is. But we spend a lot of time listening. We talk to a ton of people. We try to listen, and we put together facts in ways that we hope the public can understand, and to kind of educate everyone about the world that we live in, to try to make some sense of not just where we are now, but where we've been, and where we're going. So it's hard work, but it's fun, and we're just glad to be able to do it.
I think there's a few things that I hear from people. I think we live in an era where journalism is really maligned, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about what it is. So I get a lot of people everywhere from my kids' school to professional settings, there's a lot of yelling and, stuff like that. So there's a few things I would say. First of all, I think it's really important to understand that the opinion section and the news section are different, right? So the Times has a very robust opinion section that's all the columnists and everyone like that. And they write things that represent and the editorial board, of course, that a particular point of view. We work on the news section, which means that we approach our work with as Elizabeth was saying, with a desire to, sort of seek as much factual information as we can, because the world is complicated and facts themselves can often be complicated, which means we go through a process of vetting things. We have standards, like people are not allowed to just have attacks without their name attached to it, right? If some politician calls me and says, I want to say this guy's a, big jerk, and just have you said, a politician, senior politician, we don't do that. Like, we believe that people have a right to know who's attacking them. And those are, if we're running accusations, we, about somebody, we need multiple, or even just reporting, like a lot of political reporting is what happened behind closed doors. We need to get multiple accounts of that, and we check them against each other to ensure that is as factual as possible. And we give everyone a hearing, right? So we don't run a story, like if we're writing that someone did some misdeed or something happened or said just about anything, we're not publishing that story unless we have made every possible effort to contact that person and get their side of the story. So that's what we mean by like seeking facts. And most outlets, we live in a world where many, many outlets they don't do that kind of work. And they're also coming to it from a particular ideological point of view. That's not what the Times News is doing. And the other thing that I think is sometimes people don't quite realize is when we do the work, we're not thinking what the impact will be. It's not like you go into a story and say, oh, if I report this, X candidate will win. Or, oh, if I report this, Y thing will happen. We just report sort of what, as factually as we can. And then it's up to everyone else. The chips fall where they may, right? Like, we're not policymakers. We're not strategists. We're not like trying to influence the outcome of things. What we are trying to do is tell the story of America and the world in these really like periods of such profound change as factually as possible. And then how those things work out is up to how everyone responds to the reporting, right? Like, especially on our business desk, they don't go into it and say, we're going to move the stock price, or we're going to do this, we're going to do that. That's not what it is. And on the point of stock prices, we also have a lot of rules that we have to follow in terms of our own ethics that are actually stricter than what I've seen reported out from even the Supreme Court, it seems, these days. But like, so for example, I cover national politics. I cannot donate to any campaigns. I cannot have any campaign signs or literature. I can't speak at an event like, if some Republican consultants ask me to come talk to their firm, I can't do that. Like those are the, if you if you're on the business desk, you can't own any stock in any companies that you may cover at all. And you have to check your 401k and all of that to make sure it's not in there. I'm trying to think of another example of these. Oh, if you're on the travel desk, you're not gifted all these trips. Like you have to pay your own way for the travel, or the paper pays for you. And then we write about it. We don't accept free tickets to things. Even if, like, let's say there's some kind of big political event here's an interesting example. Biden and Obama had a big fundraiser at Radio City Music Hall, and the Biden campaign did not allow us inside to cover the fundraiser. We could not just buy a ticket to that fundraiser and go. Like we can't do that. So there's also this ethics code to ensure that as best we can, this fairness and this impartiality and this independence is maintained.
Well, I mean, thank goodness for all that rigor and
that was a very long answer. I'm sorry.
Because it differentiates you quite significantly from many alternatives, and it's totally highly valued by all of us. So let's talk about the book. I mean,
yes,
this is just an amazing book. And honestly, it's a little bit tough to interview you about because you're covering such an amazing scope. Can one of you talk just a little bit about an overview of the timeline that's covered in this?
Yes.
Sure.
One of the things we tried to do is, we realized that there hadn't been just sort of one narrative about the last decade, especially in America, in the way that this issue has played out in American politics and culture over the last 10 years. This is a topic that often gets covered kind of piecemeal, and you see like bits about state laws here and candidates here and, crisis pregnancy centers over here. And it's often quite partisan. And there isn't kind of one common narrative just about like, what is the story of what happened when it comes to abortion, reproductive rights, and the story of American women and the next generation, really. So with that in mind, it's a huge scope, as you know. I mean, Roe became a part of American life in 1973. And we were really interested in this question of how after this 50-year period did Roe fall? So we were looking at, it was interesting because we noticed that kind of for the first 40 years of the movement, there had been efforts, there have been some advances legally for the anti-abortion movement. But really, when former President Barack Obama was reelected in 2012, this movement thought that they were losing, right? They looked kind of around at America. And if you think back to what America was like then compared to now, it's actually like, it's quite different, right? The direction the country was going, it seemed like quite progressive. States were beginning to legalize gay marriage. And the vision that Obama was offering for the country was really very different than what ended up coming in with President Trump. So we thought, okay, it's such a wild story. How did this movement that really thought it was losing, right? It's a minority position to end abortion in America. That's not something the majority of Americans want. And so how did they go from this low point, like a self-described total low point when they felt like they were being abandoned even by the Republican Party, who kind of blamed them for Mitt Romney's loss in 2012. How did they go from that to suddenly this ultimate victory? And the story of that really is one of the great, the biggest stories of political resurgence in American history. And so we felt that this last decade was particularly important to understand, especially too with what the left and abortion rights supporters didn't see during that time, and kind of the that sense of what is the power of societal denial versus the power of a intense belief. So that's sort of how we started, and we weave in a lot of history because we tell this story through people, right? We tell it through the often women who are leading the anti-abortion movement, and on the left as well. We get into kind of understanding who are these people, the characters on kind of all sides of this, and what are their stories of family, their stories of pregnancy, of faith, and how at race, how does this shape them? Where did they come from? Because you can kind of then see these bigger value sets, that what we're really talking about here, and what we kind of find, and we can get into in this conversation too, is really what we saw is on the one hand, you have one value set that's really upholding conservative Christianity. And on the other, what that was up against was the values of liberal feminism. And those clashed. And especially once Trump's election hit, what we can look back and see now is that the Christians won, the conservative Christians won at that moment on this issue. So what we're looking at is these really different visions of what it means to be a woman in America and what kind of country America may be and wants to be in the future.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, one of the reasons why I like the book so much is that it honestly reads like fiction. And I mean that as a compliment.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Because you tell, as you said, you tell the stories of several individuals, over a period of time. And it feels like characters in a novel where you want to see what happens next. So, how did you decide which characters, or which people to include in their stories in the book?
Well, I think narratively, it was very important to us that it read that way because we felt that this issue was so important and so historic that we wanted to reach an audience that may be, not so inclined to pick up a typical political book or one of these books about Trump that, people that we've seen so many in recent years. And, we wanted it to be accessible to a really broad range of Americans and to tell the story in a way that would reach them. And then in terms of who we decided to feature, we also wanted it to focus not so much on the politicians, but on the movements that had really led this fight and, sort of ended up changing the country, right? And, by overturning Roe. So, the anti-abortion movement and the abortion rights movement. And we felt, particularly on this issue, it wasn't really politicians who had been leading it, both on the Republican side and on the Democratic side, that it was these activists. Mm-hmm. And so we want to focus on them. So as a result, we don't really have, it's funny because we chose pretty early in our process not to make Trump or former President Trump or President Biden major characters, right? Like we didn't think that actually they were the ones that were, a lot of times in these books about a current event topic, it is the president who is the character. But in this situation, we didn't feel like they were the ones really driving the change or the action on either side. And we thought it was these activists. We also felt it was really important to us that we'd spotlighted, and most of those activists, it's worth noting, are women. And so we really wanted to make sure that we were spotlighting their stories, that it was the women. We think of the religious right as these sort of this male movement that started in the 1980s. And what we saw in our book is that there was a change that happened in the 90s where it was women who really took over the mantle of the anti-abortion movement. And in part, that was a strategic choice that they felt women presented a better political face for their movement. And then, of course, the abortion rights movement had always been led by women. So it was important to us that those characters were female. And then we just went with the people in those movements who were really, we thought, had been the most influential over this period, that had been, driving the change and at the center of the fight and in the rooms and journalistically could tell this story the best.
The book has, some names I'd never heard of before. No. Are there any particular do you think that people are going to learn the most about through the book?
Oh, well, I'm happy in a way to hear you say that because part of what we wanted to do is bring these people who many readers might not know, like who are kind of the hands behind the scenes that are really impacting just the way that they end up living their lives. So, on the left, there may be some characters who are a bit more familiar to some listeners. People like Cecile Richards, the former head of Planned Parenthood. And on the right, we tell the story of a woman named Marjorie Dannenfelser, who leads the Susan B. Anthony, well, what's called Susan B. Anthony List, now Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America. And Kellyanne Conway, a former advisor to President Trump. What was interesting about the women on the right was in the 90s, they came to Washington in their 20s, like fresh out of college, all young Christian women, and they were looking around at the time. That was the time when Hillary Clinton first came to Washington as first lady. There were so many Democratic senators, women coming to the Hill for the first time who were Democrats and supported abortion rights. And that was getting a lot of the mainstream attention at the time because they were in the middle of their careers and this was a big thing. But we noticed that there was this sort of conservative sisterhood almost of young women who had a very different vision for certainly abortion and for the place of women in politics. So we kind of track their story. We also talk about the personal story of Leonard Leo, who maybe some of your listeners are familiar with. He is a longtime leader of the Federalist Society, which is a big network of conservative lawyers that's been quite powerful over the years. But what we do in these stories is listen to kind of the way that childbearing and pregnancy and religion really, especially for many of these people on the right, Catholicism, and their deep devotion to their faith, how that shaped them and shaped the way they see the world and kind of how they want the kind of culture that meant that they wanted to build. So I think when you kind of see the collection of the characters like that, you start to see the way that spirituality played a big role for them in driving their work.
So I came away after reading the books that feeling like, there was not a single turning point. It was just a culmination of a lot of different things that coalesced.
Mhm.
Do you see it that way, or did I miss something that
Oh,
was
I'm glad for that. You're
Yes.
asking these great things. We
Yeah.
say near the end, like the reality is that Roe didn't fall once, right? Didn't just fall. So many Americans were shocked when Roe fell. And they're like, how could this have happened? Like, how could this right that has seemed so foundational to American life just sort of disappear all of a sudden? And we wanted to unpack that shock. So what we sort of in charting like all the little moments along the way that can add up to monumental change. So we argue Roe didn't fall just once. It fell kind of 1,000 times at all of these really pivotal moments that at the time, in the moment might not have seemed that way.
Yeah, I think there's a temptation with these big historical changes to have one mastermind or one crucial moment where it all went, and it's just not how things work, right? Like, and especially with this, I think abortion rights, we say Roe was falling almost from the moment it was decided. Like, since that moment, and the anti-abortion movement had been chipping away at abortion rights in all different kinds of ways. And in this final decade, the period our book covers, which we call the final decade of the Roe era, in the book, those efforts accelerated, right? And so you see there's just so many, it was such a long plan. And there were so many different points of attack where they were coming at it. And our book really tries to document that. And it involved just this very extensive web of activists and politicians and lawyers and people to get this done.
Yeah, there were a lot of things coming in from multiple directions that
Yes.
out of there, which, is obviously a complex situation and a major situation. So that's not too surprising. But if there was one thing each of you would like readers to take away from the book, what would it be?
Mhm.
I guess the thing that really struck me, it's a really good question. And one thing I really learned in the process of all this is how much bigger the fight over abortion is than abortion itself in some ways, right? Like abortion, of course, is about whether a woman and when a woman can end her pregnancy, but the sort of the way it sits in the American psyche and in the country, particularly in this moment, but going back to before Roe, is just so much larger, right? It sits at this intersection of faith and morality and women and health and families. It sort of cuts to the heart of America in so many ways. And, depending on which side of the issue you sit, it's sort of symbolic of all these larger issues in American life. And in some ways, the role of women themselves in the American experiment and, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and all of that. So I think that's sort of what we tried to capture, that abortion is symbolic of all these larger things and larger changes in American life. And in some ways it tells us a lot, like the evolution of this issue over the past decade tells us a lot about the evolution of our politics. I think there's a lot of people in America right now who are looking at what's happening politically and saying like, well, how did we get here? How did things become so polarized, so contentious? How does the system, both sides, both people who support former President Trump and President Biden often say to me, how did the system become so broken? And I think when you unpack the story of abortion, you really begin to see a lot of those things and understand a lot of those things. And it's a way of like understanding these larger issues. So that's what I would really like people to take away, that yes, this is a book about the fight over abortion, but it's a book that encompasses so much more. And that if you want to understand the state of American politics, this is a book that will help you get there. And particularly before this election cycle that we're in the midst of, that is going to be, it's good. We're all sort of, I think the entire country is already bracing itself for the fall with this. So that I think that would be what I would like readers to take away.
Mm-hmm.
Elizabeth, how about you?
Yeah. Oh, I echo what Lisa said there. And I guess I'd add, maybe this isn't a takeaway, maybe it's kind of like going into it. But I think so often on these very contentious issues, it's easy perhaps to go into it like kind of already knowing like what the outcome, like what the answer is in your own mind, and not being very open-minded, kind of just about encountering stories of other people's lives. And one of the things in the book, the way we kind of put the lives of these very, very opposing viewpoints kind of in conversation with each other throughout the chapters. What we've heard from some early readers of the book has been that they have actually learned a lot, and it's taken them places that they hadn't quite expected. And that's pretty gratifying to just for the conversation about all this itself, right? Like it can be kind of an issue, I think, that some people just sort of shove like, oh, we can't go there. No one can go there. It's too impossible to go there. But actually, I think it's the way you get there, right? And really this adopting this posture of listening and learning and kind of seeking to understand is really helpful. I mean, there's just so much to learn from history. One of the things we often say as journalists, sometimes like you're documenting these things and you don't, when you're doing kind of the shorter term story, not a book, it's a much longer time scale, but the shorter term story, you're really looking at like, what is this like right now, right? You're kind of seeing the slice for this moment. But we say sometimes, yes, you're writing for the audience today, but you're really writing for history. You're doing this first draft of history. You're writing for people to come, right? To be able to understand who they are and how they got there. And so I would love to hear from readers, if as they engage the material, what that experience has been like for them, and if it's opened new conversations, new personal commitments, and kind of how they want to engage their society.
Well, as we discussed before, I think this book is going to have a long tail, and what you just described is one of the reasons for that.
Oh.
Because you went into great depth that most people didn't have any clue about a lot of that background, right? And so you've documented, and in an unbiased, nonpartisan way.
Thank you.
So, I think that will
Thank you.
stand the test of time of people going back and trying to figure out, what really happened that led to this. So I think that alone, I think is quite an accomplishment.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, I realized after being around the publishing industry for a while that the time from when you finish a manuscript to when it shows up in print doesn't happen overnight, right?
No.
And at the end of the book, you do share a few thoughts after the fall occurred. Is there anything more you'd add to that now?
Well, our timeline was actually quite tight because it was we're used to tight deadlines. That's our life's work, I guess. But we finished the book in early March, and it came out June 4th. So for publishing,
You're kidding.
No.
Oh,
yeah.
I had no idea. That is atypical.
Yes.
Our
It's
publisher
a little crazy. We're a little crazy.
Letting us kind of get as close as we could to, because just like as you're mentioning, the scope of changing politics and current events, we wanted to be able to get some of it. But you're right. The dynamic has changed a lot. The politics have completely changed. This cycle, this presidential cycle, in a way, if Roe was the foundation for kind of 50 years, like operating in the background of how politics worked and making abortion a motivating issue primarily for Republicans, the backlash to this decision to overturn Roe has really roiled the country and been now a mobilizing issue for Democrats. And it's this is all kind of changing in real time, but the anti-abortion movement, I think, is, it's on the back foot in a way that it's not used to being. Since their historic monumental victory, I think no one really was prepared exactly for what this would mean. So we are really seeing that play out in real time, and it's, of course, we get a little tiny bit into the book about this at the end, but forecasting about what this means for procedures like IVF and how, what that means for how people can build their families. And the anti-abortion movement, overturning Roe was always not the end. It was the beginning. There are still a minority position, quite a minority, excuse me. But they are committed to ending all abortion in America. They're not stopping. And so because they think in kind of these generational terms, they're not set back in the same way. They're not like, oh, we're having a political setback right now. This is it for us. It's just sort of taking it in stride and figuring out how to regroup and plan for the long term. So I think we're in the middle of that now. Lisa, is there anything you'd want to say?
Yeah, I think, in my business, which is covering politics, you learn very early on not to be predictive, that you only get in trouble when you're predictive, particularly in the past 8 years or so that we've had in our politics. So we really tried to shy away from that in the book. But I think I just generally shy away from that, particularly when it comes to this issue, because the country is, as Elizabeth said, changing so fast politically on this. But I think one thing that we probably would have put in that we didn't get to put in was just former President Trump's shifts on the issue and how he sort of he had won with support from the anti-abortion movement. They made common cause with him and helped get him into office. And now he's really backed away from them in a way that's quite striking, given as the issue has become more toxic for Republican candidates. And so we do talk quite a bit in the book about, or some in the book, I guess I should say, about Trump's sort of pivots on the issue. He's really been all over the map, from supportive of abortion rights to staunchly against them. And this feels like another sort of turn for him. And I think we would have probably included that. But generally, I think because our tight turnaround, we're pretty up to date at the end. But it was always sort of our idea to do the final decade of the Roe era, and the capstone of that, of course, is the case that ended Roe. So I think that would be the only major thing I think I would have added in.
Well, I know you don't like to be predictive, but I'm going to ask you a couple questions that focus on the future a little bit. First question is, what else do you think might fall in addition to Roe?
That's a really good question. It's one we're asked quite a lot. Thomas, in his opinion in Dobbs, hinted that other precedents could be up for reevaluation. He pointed to, a ruling on contraception, which has really attracted a lot of attention. There's very few issues in American public life that have broad, like 80% support. Access to contraception is one of them, from what we know from the polling, and people are worried about that. The polling also tells us that people are worried about, laws that could curb access to contraception. So that would be something that, the court and the anti-abortion movement isn't pursuing that in a sort of broad way. There are elements of it that are pursuing, banning certain types of contraception. But it's not like a movement-wide goal. There's really a lot of dispute within the movement over what they should do on that. I think if they were to decide to pursue that, it would be really controversial and politically inflammatory in American life. But that is one area that people talk about. We also got internal documents from ADF, which is the group of lawyers that was very, very involved in the case that ended Roe, sort of pointing towards their future goals, and some of their goals dealt with attacking a right to same-sex marriage, or attacking trans rights, or maybe targeting how religion in the public sphere. So things like prayer in school or in public meetings. So that's some of the direction.
Trying to expand.
Yeah, trying to expand that. Right.
In,
yes.
Businesses and things like that.
Yeah, so that's some of what seems like it could be on the horizon. But again, these are plans that were laid before the politics just were scrambled by the impact of the decision. So that, it's hard to suss out how all this is going to go down.
So another, kind of related question. I mean, do you, I'm going to ask you, weather reporter here, do you feel like the pendulum is swinging in the other direction, or when that might be, if that might be?
Well,
in terms of the politics, or
abortion, right? Particularly, I guess.
Yeah,
just try to focus on that. I mean,
yeah, I think it's it's hard to know. So what we do know is that in many states where activists for abortion rights are putting the issue directly to voters on the ballot, like kind of going around the state legislators and just asking voters directly to support access to abortion. It's passed in every state where this has happened, which is a huge threat to the left, to the right. They're really, really concerned about that. And I guess more of a big picture thing, I think, the lesson of what of the fall of Roe, right, is that a victory may not last forever, right? A victory can become a defeat, and a defeat can turn into a victory, and it's just the time scale about that, and the commitment and long-standing plans. I mean, we also see that the things that even Hillary Clinton said to us in the book, that the left is just, I'm paraphrasing, but the left is they just don't have anything like kind of the infrastructure that the right set up in key places to be able to pull the levers of power in order to affect the change that they wanted to see in society. So there's some, those things don't just happen overnight, right? If activists on the left choose to do that, it's going to take some real time and a new level of organization, which we are starting to see, but it takes a long time.
And the only thing I would add, and this sounds kind of trite, but the future is not going to look like the past, right? Democrats and President Biden have promised to sort of restore Roe or to codify Roe into federal law. That is not impossible, but that is going to be very, very hard to do unless they can get support for eliminating the filibuster, which is the rule requiring them to have 60 votes, of course, in the Senate. It's just going to be really hard. The idea that Democrats could get 60 votes to restore federal abortion rights feels quite challenging. Whether they could get the votes to get rid of the filibuster and do it on a simple majority, that's a different question. That's also far from a sure bet. And nobody even agrees on what such a thing should look like. Should they go back to the Roe standard, which basically allowed abortion up until fetal viability, which is considered around 23, 24 weeks or so, or should it be more expansive or less expansive? There have been a couple different bills. They've all looked a little different. So I just think this is now going to be, as the Supreme Court predicted, a state-by-state fight. And what you are seeing is abortion rights supporters pushing back, as Elizabeth said, with these referendums fairly effectively in states, more and more and more. But it's not the idea that we could somehow magically restore this federal standard of abortion rights feels much trickier when you look at the political landscape.
So let's finish up by talking about something more fun. You have some book launch events coming up. Would you like to tell folks what your plans are?
Sure.
Sure.
We are speaking in New York at the 14th Street Y for a launch event next week. And we've got a few bookstore events. You can go to our website, thefallofroe.com, for the most updated list. We'll be adding to it. And we really hope to be kind of engaging this conversation with readers throughout this whole year. So if you want us to come to your city or your event, like, please let us know. We're in the process of putting together a bigger schedule for the fall. And we know this is such a live conversation in so many communities. So we'd love to support local bookstores, women-owned bookstores. And please just let us know. You can write to us on our website also, thefallofroe.com.
Awesome. Well, I think you'll get a lot of askers, for requests for you guys to come, because I think it's going to get a lot of attention. I think it's a wonderful book, really deep, as I said, and factual, enlightening. But I have to ask you, it's like, I know you're in the middle of a launch something like this, but do you see a sequel?
My goodness.
Oh God, please. I appreciate the question, but we're building, what do they say? We're building the plane as we are landing it. Like, we finished this book. We finished this book in the middle, like, we were reporting, I was in Iowa for the caucuses, and we're like still making final reporting calls and fine-tuning text. Like, we finished it. It's in the store 3 months later. Like, oh my God, we gotta get through. I think we loved working together, and it's been a really wonderful partnership for both of us in terms of our skills and our sources and what we sort of bring to the table. I think we complement each other. So I suspect we would love to do something else together down the line, but I don't know. I have a bunch of kids and a husband who I think would just about kill me if I told them I was starting another book, and then they would kill Elizabeth too. That's what you said.
Well, take a break. Yeah. Take a break.
Yes.
But then I really hope you guys
to get through.
We really appreciate the interest, and in the work. It really means a lot because it's just such an important topic for everyone. And so, we'd love to hear from readers what you make of it and how you're kind of processing all of this.
Good. Well, I hope you do, either follow on to this, or, I think you all could tackle some other issues in a similar kind of way, methodology-wise, and you two collaborating. So I hope that happens.
Thank you.
Oh, it's very kind. Thank you.
Well, we've appreciated this conversation so much.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. Again, the title of the book is The Fall of Roe, The Rise of a New America. So go to thefallofroe.com or nytimes.com. You can learn more about Lisa and Elizabeth, and flatironbooks.com. So thank you all again, and best wishes with the rest of the launch. I hope it goes really well.
Thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you.
Take care.